Imagine what's possible when learning doesn't get in the way of life. At Capella University, our game-changing FlexPath learning format lets you set your own deadlines so you can learn at a time and pace that works for you. It's an education you can tailor to your schedule. That means you don't have to put your life on hold to pursue your professional goals. Instead, enjoy learning your way and earn your degree without missing a beat. A different future is closer than you think with Capella University. Learn more at capella.edu.
This series contains adult language and descriptions of graphic violence. Listener discretion is advised. Hello, listeners, friends. It is Thursday around noon. And I realize this episode is late, which seems to be kind of my thing lately. But it's because this is like, how do I begin? This story was suggested by a Patreon member. And when I first looked into it, I was like, oh, whoa, this is a terrible but fascinating story. And then when I continued to look into it, it just got deeper and deeper and more information. And so yesterday I was like, I'm not done yet. I'm not done researching this. And honestly, I could probably continue to research this for a very long while and not be even close to as done as I'd like to be. But I do really want to tell this story, and I've spent an inordinate amount of time researching it. This may be a multi-part story. I'm just going to say that right off the top here. And also right off the top, I'd like to make it very well known that much of this story takes place in Mexico. There are a lot of people in this story, towns, cities, all kinds of things that I'm going to absolutely and completely butcher saying them. So I'm going to apologize ahead of time, but I know that it can be annoying when I don't know how to pronounce something and I like stop and I'm like, oh, did I say that right? I'm not sure. And so I don't want to do that throughout the whole entire, throughout this whole entire episode. So rather than that, I'm just telling you from the beginning. I'm just going to like go with my initial gut instinct as to how to pronounce things, and it's probably going to be wrong, but I'm just going to keep going. So please don't be offended. But yeah, this is I almost just said this is a killer story and then laughed, and that's totally inappropriate. So I take it back, but it is. This is a crazy story. And it kind of, so like I said, it takes place partially in Mexico. I swear I'm not just going to talk about how crazy it is. I'm actually going to tell it soon. But this has to do with, I don't have like a description to read you at first. I mean, it has to do with the cartel and spring break and magic, black magic, white magic, drugs. It's got a little bit of everything. And I'm sure I've said probably when we started this podcast at the very beginning that the cartel in general in Mexico is super fascinating to me. And I don't know if I need to keep like qualifying this, but I know that's terrible. Like the cartel is absolutely horrific and disgusting and awful. And yet it still is incredibly just interesting to me, that all of it, how it operates, how it came to be. Yeah. So this story, pretty quickly, I was like, oh, this is one that I'm going to like. And I say that respectfully for the people who lost their lives in this story. But it's a crazy story. So let's jump into it. I'm not even going to do any type of real intro because I am going to do a little sense of place. We have not had any stories in either of these locations. And this story involves two locations, one here in the United States and one in Mexico. So the first location is South Padre Island, which is in Texas. It's a barrier island along the Gulf Coast, located near the southernmost tip of Texas, very close to the U.S.-Mexico border. Approximately 2,800 residents, but that changes significantly during like peak tourist seasons. Now, the weather in South Padre Island is pretty decent year round, but spring break and summer is when a lot of people visit South Padre Island. It's known for beautiful, beautiful beaches. The Gulf obviously has amazing, warm, clear water. And it's just got a really vibrant tourism industry. Like I said, very popular for spring break. I remember when I was even in high school, which was 150 years ago, people talking about like, are we going to go to, I didn't go anywhere for spring break, but there were people in my grade talking about, by like junior, senior year, where are we going for spring break? Bermuda, maybe not Bermuda. Maybe it was the Bahamas. I think Jenna actually went to the Bahamas for her spring break. I believe she did. But I remember people talking about going to South Padre Island. After learning this story, I'm really glad that I didn't. But it is supposed to be a beautiful and super fun party kind of place. It also has a lot of activities: kiteboarding, fishing, parasailing, dolphin watching. It's very well known for its bird watching, because it is, it's part of the Central Flyway, which is apparently a major migratory path for birds. So bird enthusiasts, human GPS, I'm talking to you. Maybe you've been here, but it's supposed to be an amazing place for bird watching. They also have on South Padre Island sea turtle rescue programs and Laguna Madre Bay, which is referred to as one of the few hypersaline lagoons in the world. I'd never heard of a hypersaline lagoon. And it is apparently a body of water usually connected to the ocean that has a significantly higher salt concentration than normal seawater. So I guess it's kind of exactly how it sounds. There is Sea Turtle Inc., which is a conservation center dedicated to rescuing and rehabilitating sea turtles. Love that. And since it's a barrier island, it serves as kind of a natural buffer against hurricanes and storm surges, which protects the inland areas. Local events include sandcastle competitions and a lot of fishing tournaments. And that's it. That's South Padre Island. There's definitely more to the island than that, but that is your very quick overview. And the second place is Matamoros, Mexico. It's on the southern bank of the Rio Grande. It's directly across from Brownsville, Texas, about 28 miles from the Gulf of Mexico. And being right there on the border, it's a busy crossing point for cocaine, fentanyl, methamphetamine, weapons, and contraband. I almost just said, it's weird that it didn't say marijuana, but I guess that's not really a thing anymore now. Population, approximately 500,000. The Matamoros Brownsville metropolitan area. And this is, I still totally don't, I understand it, but I don't. But like along the border between Mexico and Texas, I know that there's lots of areas that are referred to like this, like Matamoros Brownsville metropolitan area. Matamoros is in Mexico. Brownsville is in Texas. But because they are literally so close, like you could see, if you could be in Mexico. I don't know actually about this particular place. I don't know about Brownsville and Matamoros. I've never been specifically there, but I have been specifically when driving from Tucson back to Atlanta when I was living in Atlanta. I have driven and stayed actually in El Paso, Texas, which like there are certain points where you're driving on the 10. That's what I took for much of the way from Tucson to Atlanta, where I'm on obviously the Texas side, but I can see Mexico. It's right there. I could throw a rock to Mexico. It's so close. I mean, you're right there. So I didn't really realize that growing up in Chicago and then moving to Tucson when I was in college. I didn't do a whole lot of cross country driving until my mom got sick. And I was living in Atlanta. So I don't think that I really realized, and I'm explaining this so much because if you've never been to a border city, then, that may not be clear. You may think that you can't see right over the border so easily. Anyways, I probably went on too long about that, but it was really weird to me the first time driving through El Paso, that I'm driving literally, here's the fence separating Mexico and the United States. So the Matamoros, Brownsville metropolitan area has a population of about 1.3 million, making it the fourth largest metropolitan area on the Mexico-U.S. border. There's some interesting historical significance. It was involved in battles during the Mexican War of Independence, the Mexican Revolution, the Texas Revolution, the Mexican-American War, and the American Civil War. But what is really known, or at least in the United States, I don't know about people living there, but what Matamoros is definitely known for is the violent crime, kidnappings. There are cartels. There's the Gulf cartel that controls most aspects of crime in Matamoros, but there's also the Cartel de Noreste, and that's the rival cartel. So there's lots of cartel violence. I actually read something that said Matamoros is a city where killings and disappearances are so common that they rarely even make headlines anymore. A lot of drug-related violence and lots of travel advisories for people who might be interested in going. It's not a great idea. A criminal investigator in Mexico said, so Matamoros is in the state of Tamaulipas, I think. And she's quoted as saying, Tamaulipas is a state where there is no justice. All its former governors have faced legal procedures. So this is something that I would love to do, explore in a different episode. But I was reading several articles about kind of the governors and people of positions of power and how they are, corrupt, even down to emergency responders are corrupt. It's really mind-blowing. Channel 5 News, in one article I read, spoke to several Matamoros residents. Many of them said they try to live a normal life despite living in constant fear. Sylvia Vicencio said it's been 2.5 years since one of her 6 children disappeared from her home in Matamoros. She believes that he was a victim of organized crime. She said, I don't even drive my truck anymore. They'll take your trucks. They'll take your money. And the biggest travel advisory that I saw was to avoid crossing into Mexico via land routes, particularly in Matamoros, because apparently there's just tons of carjackings and violence at those border crossing points. So it says, regardless of destination, travelers should avoid crossing into Mexico via land routes if possible, particularly at Reynosa, Juarez, Juarez is right on the other side of El Paso. And so I'm sure I've told this story, but one of the first times that I was driving back to Atlanta from Tucson, coming from Atlanta, I took a more northern route, but going home, there was a bunch of snowstorms and I couldn't take the more northern route. I didn't have 4-wheel drive. I had Izzy with me. And so the safest option was to take the 10, which takes you just right along the border, right through El Paso, and right in you're looking at Juarez. And it's incredibly dangerous. And I was the first time since I'd never done it, I was like petrified. I was terrified that I was going to get carjacked. I don't know why I thought, like, what am I going to get carjacked while I'm driving 75 miles per hour on the highway? No. But in my head, I was terrified. It wasn't actually scary at all. I probably wouldn't stop for gas right there, but I did have to spend the night. And I stayed at like I don't know, whatever, La Quinta or something. And it was fine. It was fine. But anyways, avoid land routes. I always say it differently. At Reynosa, Juarez, Nuevo Laredo, and Matamoros, where the risk of carjacking and robbery is especially high. It says avoid traveling by bus in or through the state of Tamaulipas. If you have to cross the border, only cross the border during the day. Do not bring any expensive bags, watches, anything that looks of value. Avoid driving a car with foreign plates or plates from a different Mexican state. So essentially, if you live in the United States, do not drive into Matamoros. And we are about to find out why. So our story today is going to focus on Mark Kilroy, who at the time of our story was 21 years old. Mark was born March 5th, 1968 in Chicago, Illinois, and his parents moved with him from Chicago to Texas shortly after he was born. So he grew up in Santa Fe, Texas, which is a small town just outside of Houston. And he had a brother, Keith. He was raised Catholic. His family frequented church. Mark seemed like an amazing all-around, like, good kid. He did well in school, was very athletic, played baseball, basketball, golf. He was active in the Boy Scouts of America. He was a member of student council at Santa Fe High School. He was an honors student. He actually ranked 14th out of 210 students in his class, in his grade. He graduated in 1986 and started off his college career at Southwest Texas State University in San Marcos. After not too long, he decided to transfer to Tarleton State University in Stephenville, Texas. He got a basketball scholarship there. And while there, he joined the Lambda Chi Alpha fraternity. A little bit later in his college career, he decided to kind of give up on the frat life and basketball, and he wanted to focus on pre-med studies. So he transferred to the University of Texas at Austin, where he was pre-med, preparing to take the MCATs. That's about where our story begins. So Mark and his friend Bradley Moore were very excited about their upcoming spring break. They had actually been excited about spring break like all year, which I understand, especially if you have something fun planned, which they did. But before we get to that, they were very good friends. Mark, like I said, was in Austin, pre-med. Bradley was a sophomore studying electrical engineering at Texas A&M. They talked on the phone at least twice a week, just catching up on kind of all the basics. Before college, they had grown up together. They went to high school together, played basketball together. And the prior year, they had actually both gone for spring break to South Padre Island, which is where they were going this year. But the previous year, they didn't go together. And this year, they were going together. So on Friday, March 10th, spring break began for Bradley. He left his home in Bryan, Texas, got into his Mustang, and drove to Austin to pick up Mark. Once he got Mark, the two of them together then headed to Santa Fe to meet up with their other two friends, Bill Huddleston and Brent Martin. They had all played basketball together growing up, and we're now going on spring break together. All 4 of them together were quite a sight to see. They were all pretty tall and athletic, very clean cut and handsome, and all of them were pretty serious students. None of them were like drug users, of course partied, but like a reasonable amount of partying. I saw them described as the type of young men that parents would hope their daughters would date or marry. So on their drive to their spring break plans, they were just reminiscing. Bradley said, we talked about how it would probably be our last summer at home all together. So this was a really special trip for them. So I guess they changed cars somewhere along the way. And just after midnight on Friday, they began their road trip to South Padre Island, taking Brent's Cutlass. It was a 9-hour drive along the Texas coastline. It was a little bit of a slow drive because there was a lot of heavy fog then. So they arrived mid-morning Saturday and checked into the Sheridan, which I thought this tells you how big spring break was here in South Padre Island. The Sheridan would remove all of the lobby furniture in preparation for spring break because people were it was just like a party, one big party for all of spring break. So the guys checked in, took a shower, got some food, and then headed right to the beach. And it was apparently opening weekend of the island's 5-week spring break season, which I guess different colleges have obviously different spring breaks, and high schools depending on where you live in the country. So I'd imagine, like it said, spring break was, more than a week, the season in South Padre Island. Why did I need to explain that so much? So there was tons and tons of students on the island. More and more were coming every day. There was big events sponsored by beer companies and alcohol brands, movies, concerts, surfing, simulator rides. It was just a constant party. Apparently there were also religious groups present that would walk around and hand out suntan lotion and encourage students to pray instead of party. The 4 friends were having a great time. They got to participate in a beer company that was filming a commercial at a swimming pool. That night they went out and partied with some girls that they met from Purdue University who were actually staying in an adjoining room to theirs. By the next day, by Sunday, they've kind of gotten into like a routine. They would go to the beach in the morning, have lunch, and then the afternoons they would spend at the Miss Tan Line contest behind the Sheridan. The contest, I believe, is exactly as it sounds, a tan line contest. There was some controversy over this contest when the MC of the contest tried to enforce rules against nudity, but the crowd wanted nudity. In the afternoons, they would nap and rest up and get all cleaned up for their nighttime adventures. So that night they dined at a Sonic drive-in in Port Isabel. They met some girls from the University of Kansas who were heading to Matamoros. So they got together with these girls from the University of Kansas and they drove the narrow 24-mile stretch to Brownsville, parked on the Texas side of the International Bridge and walked across to Mexico and spent an evening at Sergeant Pepper's bar before they parted ways with the girls and headed back across the border, back to their hotel, back to South Padre Island. So it's interesting. Again, this is just another instance of going to college here in Tucson I only went for a year here and then I transferred up to Flagstaff. But that was like a huge part of my freshman year is they had a van, again, I've probably told this, that would pick us up at the dorms and everybody paid, I don't know, 20, 40, something like that bucks to the driver. And the driver would drive us down across the border. He actually drove us over the border. We didn't park and walk, but Jenna and I went down to Mexico, I don't know, last year sometime, and parked in a parking lot, a paid parking lot on this side, and then walked across so that I could get some inhalers. So that may sound strange, but it's a fairly normal thing to do, certainly here in Tucson and obviously in places in Texas, although this takes place, back in the late 80s, but today probably not recommended to do that, at least here, at least in Matamoros. So Monday they spent another sunny day on the beach. Mark, his friends were excited for him because he was chatting it up with a contestant from the Miss Tan Line contest. That night they went to a condo party. Some of Mark's old frat brothers were there and were having a party in a condo. And around 10:30 p.m., they decided to head back to Matamoros. They parked again on the Texas side, walked across the border. And that night in particular, the border town was overrun with around 15,000 spring breakers, just filling the bars, filling the sidewalks, partying in the streets. So once the boys got across the bridge, they chose to go to a bar that seemed to have the shortest line. It was called Los Sombreros. It was a loud nightclub. It was not exactly a safe place. Apparently the year before, in July of 1988, there was a shootout at Los Sombreros that left the owner's son dead, allegedly at the hands of a gang member from the Hernandez gang called El Doobie. And remember that name. So barroom shootings and people vanishing were pretty common in Matamoros, though it generally wasn't, at least at this point in time, it wasn't American tourists. That was not super common. So the guys were partying at Los Sombreros. They moved on to a place called London Pub. It was even louder and rowdier. People were throwing beer cans off the balcony. Around 2 a.m., Bill Huddleston said, "It's time to go back to the island. Let's get out of here." So outside the bar, his friends saw Mark leaning against a Volkswagen talking to that girl that he had met from the Miss Tan Line contest. There were tons of people, so nobody was necessarily paying super close attention to each other. Obviously, they were trying to all stay together, but again, 15,000 students, it was crazy. So Bradley and Brent were walking a little bit ahead of Bill and Mark. Mark said goodbye to this girl, waited for Bill to catch up. Bill walked away for a minute to pee. So if you can I'm just trying to set the scene that you can, these four guys are trying to stay somewhat together while making their way back to walk across the border to their car to go home. They've been drinking all evening. Bill walks away to go pee. Mark was talking to this girl. Bradley and Brent are kind of walking ahead. And so Bill goes to pee, and when he comes back and kind of runs to catch up with Bradley and Brent, he's like, "Where's Mark?" They're like, "We thought Mark was with you." So they couldn't find him, and the bars were closing now, and the three friends are searching everywhere because they're not going to go back across the border without him. And so they are searching. Hours they're panicking now. It was kind of like he had disappeared into thin air. What Mark and his friends didn't know was that a 20-year-old actually student from Texas, but who was living in Mexico, named Serafin. He was a member of the cartel. He was sitting in his truck watching all the spring breakers going in and out of the bars and partying on the street. He's just sitting in his truck watching all of this kind of unfold for several hours. Of course, Mark, Bill, none of them noticed him. Nobody noticed this guy. He was just sitting in a truck. So of course, nobody knew that he had joined this cult and cartel to please his uncle, Elio. He was not thrilled to be part of it, but once he was in, he realized there was no way out. So a little history on Seraphin, because he will also be a big part of this story. His family apparently rose from poverty into wealth by becoming a part of a major marijuana operation. And Seraphin's uncle was Elio, and another relative of his, Saul Hernandez, was the driving force behind this marijuana operation, and really established a lot of dominance in Matamoros during this. It was kind of like a drug boom in the 80s here. But Saul was assassinated in 1986. The family went through a lot of hardship. There was a lot of leadership struggles. And that's when Elio, Seraphin's uncle, ended up taking control on the Mexican side. And Seraphin's father was supposed to take control on the U.S. side. He was arrested. Once again, there's a lot of disputes. Everything was just destabilized in this drug family, the Hernandez drug family. And as I talked about earlier, Matamoros was really kind of like a hot spot for drug trafficking, violence, cartel activity, frequent killings and violence between rival cartels, rival dealers. But they were still having a hard time. They were kind of the Hernandez drug operation was one of the more powerful ones, but there were still rivalries and tensions and things that were like undermining their operations. So Seraphin's uncle decided that what they needed was protection. And for a lot of, I know we've talked about this in previous episodes, the idea of kind of magic. And I think differently than how we think of magic in Mexico, is protection, like spiritual protection, rather than like, I'm going to make this rabbit disappear into my hat. So what Elio decided was, we need protection. We need like magic, spiritual protection. So Elio reached out to a man named Adolfo Constanzo, who lived in Mexico City in an apartment with a group of male companions. Constanzo was 26. And it was funny because I was reading this, it said that he was older than like a lot of the other people in the Hernandez cartel or the Hernandez drug family. And I was like, 26 is really young. But I guess compared to a lot of the members of this drug family and cartel, 26 was a bit older. Seraphin was, only 20, I guess. So Constanzo was more polished. He was more kind of charismatic and outgoing, and just seemed more like a kind of a... When I was reading about him, it made me think of like a mobster in like Casino or Goodfellas, just like really smooth talking, dressed well, confident. He was known for frequenting gay bars. He had a bit of a flashy lifestyle. But he was also articulate. He was well educated, and he was described as exuding kind of like a Charles Manson like intensity. It was both scary and intriguing. So this Constanzo proposed to Elio that he would become the I don't know whether I should be calling them a gang or a cartel. I think it's for the purposes of this story, it's very much the same. So he proposed becoming the gang's high priest. He said, I can protect you from any enemies, but in return, I want a share of your drug profits, and I will protect your drug business so that you make more and more money. So he used, apparently he was known for using religious rituals, different forms of mind control to try and manipulate like his gang members or followers. Again, he was compared to Charles Manson, how Charles Manson used the Beatles song Helter Skelter. Constanzo drew inspiration from a movie called The Believers, which revolved around black magic. He also suggested that human sacrifices would need to be used in rituals in order to really protect the Hernandez gang.
Hey, I'm Ryan Reynolds. Recently, I asked Mint Mobile's legal team if big wireless companies are allowed to raise prices due to inflation. They said yes. And then when I asked if raising prices technically violates those onerous 2-year contracts, they said, what the f*** are you talking about, you insane Hollywood ass f- So to recap, we're cutting the price of Mint Unlimited from $30 a month to just $15 a month. Give it a try at mintmobile.com/switch.
$45 upfront payment equivalent to $15 per month. New customers on first 3-month plan only. Taxes and fees extra. Speed slower above 40 gigabytes. See details.
So initially when these human sacrifices began, the victims were generally rival drug dealers, dirty cops, things like that. People who were enemies of the Hernandezes. And so Elio was made what they refer to as an executioner, and he was a brutal one at that. And I'm going to read something taken from an article. This is verbatim from this article describing Elio as an executioner. He was said to have cut out one rival's heart while the man was still alive. The planned execution of a Matamoros cop named Sauceda produced fireworks when Sauceda pulled out a gun, and Elio had to shoot him before the ceremony began. The cop's sudden and untimely death left the gang without a victim to sacrifice. Elio sent 3 of his men out to grab the first person they could find, who happened to be a 14-year-old boy looking for his lost goat. They threw a gunny sack over the boy's head and took him to Elio, who promptly decapitated the boy with a machete, never bothering to look at his face. As the headless body flopped across the floor, Elio was struck by something familiar. It was the boy's gray and green football jersey. Terror flooded Elio's dark eyes as he reached for the gunny sack. He had just executed his own nephew. And I almost cried when I heard, looking for his lost goat. Ugh, it's awful. So, apparently, Seraphin had been told by Constanzo, the high priest, not his uncle apparently, but actually by Adolfo Constanzo, that they needed to find a typical gringo for human sacrifice. Well, Mark Kilroy was blonde, very clean cut, looks like an all-American, typical gringo. So apparently, Seraphin, and he had 3 additional gang members with him. They grabbed Kilroy, Mark, when Bill stepped away to go pee. Mark had said goodbye to that girl, and he was walking a bit behind his other 2 friends. That's when he was grabbed. They wrestled him into a pickup truck and quickly drove away. After driving for a little bit, Seraphin stopped the truck to get out and relieve himself. He had to pee. And Mark apparently was able to escape for a brief moment, but the gang, there was another car with gang members in it that came up and were able to capture him. And then they handcuffed him in the back seat of their vehicle. He was driven through the quieter back streets of Matamoros. They were driving further and further away from the city. They eventually got somewhere. Mark obviously didn't know where. And he was left handcuffed in the back seat of the car. It was a Suburban. For the rest of the night, everyone else left the car and he was stuck there, had no idea what was going on, where he was, nothing. Around dawn that next morning, an elderly caretaker supposedly brought him a small meal with eggs, bread, and water. And then it had been about 12 hours since he had been captured. So remember, the boys were going to head back to South Padre Island around 2 a.m.-ish. So that's probably around when he was captured. So 12 hours after that, Constanzo came with a handful of other gang members, came for Mark. They blindfolded him. They gagged him with duct tape. They kept his hands cuffed behind his back, and they led him across a field. By this time, it was early afternoon. His friends were probably back in South Padre Island because they didn't stay in Matamoros. They figured maybe Mark had found a different route home. And so they went back to South Padre Island, only, of course, to discover he was not there because he was being led, blindfolded, gagged, handcuffed into a shed that smelled like rotting meat. Now, Mark's friends, of course, are back in South Padre Island freaking out at this point and reporting him missing to the police. And Mark is, I can only imagine, terrified right now. But unfortunately, whatever fear he was dealing with was not going to compare to the horror that awaited him. So, Mark's friends report him missing. And of course, initially, the search for Mark begins as kind of a routine missing persons investigation. The police said that, it wasn't that uncommon. There were certainly instances where students were reported missing in Matamoros, but in the past, this is what they told Mark's friends. They would usually turn up in a day or two, hungover, didn't have much memory of what happened to them, but safe and fine. That did not happen though, as the hours turned to days. Mark's family is now involved, and Mark has not returned with a hangover and a blurry memory. He is still gone. So as days continue going past, that was a really weird way to say that. As time continues passing, Mark's family and officials in both Mexico and the United States are becoming significantly more and more worried and eventually frantic. But there was very little to go on. They didn't have, first of all, I can only imagine how, of all the stories that we've told on here and all the just stories that you, me, everyone has heard of people who go missing in general, it's hard enough when you go missing just in the state that you're in, the country you're from. So to go missing when you're, first of all, visiting a different city from where you live. Remember, Mark was going to school in Austin, visiting South Padre Island, and then disappears across the border in Mexico while drinking, while there's an additional 15,000 students in Matamoros that night. There was very little, if any, concrete kind of clues to go on. Of course, the police, both in the United States and Mexico, are, putting this out to the media, are asking for help, asking for tips, anything. None of the tips that they were getting were very useful. Apparently, some man who called himself a Satanist in Brownsville, Texas, he came in and confessed to murdering Mark and burying his body on the beach. Under further questioning, he recanted that. It wasn't true. Customs agents took Mark's friends back into Matamoros to retrace their steps. That didn't bring about anything. Texas officials contacted the U.S. consulate in Matamoros, asked them to help search in local jails and hospitals. That turned up nothing. So investigators then hired a hypnotist to help hopefully get additional clues from Mark's friends. So they were going to hypnotize Mark's friends and see if they could remember anything else. Under hypnosis, Bradley recalled seeing a young Hispanic man with a scar and a blue plaid shirt approach Mark, saying, "Hey, don't I know you from somewhere?" But beyond that, the hypnosis did not bring up anything. None of the friends could remember the exact moment or location when Mark was suddenly gone. And this is something that since doing this podcast, I really, I've talked to Mark about it and Jenna about it, that like, I try to be extra aware of my surroundings, especially if I'm somewhere at night, like noticing what cars are parked on the street, or noticing what cars are parked next to me in the parking lot if I'm going to the grocery store or something, which seems silly, but apparently it's helpful to do that. It helps train your brain a bit to be more aware of your surroundings, and hopefully nothing like, this, like a disappearance would ever happen to me or anybody I know. But it would be super helpful if Mark's friends had been a little bit more aware. But then you put yourself in that position, or at least I put myself in this position. I'm thinking, okay, we're drinking for hours. We're on vacation. We're having such a fun time. Everybody's just drunk and like a million, they didn't feel like they were in any danger. There's a million other teenager or young adult 20 somethings around them doing the same thing. So I can only imagine that it would be next to impossible to remember. You're in a place that you don't know with people you don't know, and drinking is involved. Oh my God, you're not going to remember anything. So the friends were of very little use. As more time passed, the authorities, certainly in Mexico, began getting concerned that perhaps Mark may have been a victim of drug-related violence, maybe a robbery gone wrong. Now, there were no solid leads or clues to back up either of these theories. But because there was no ransom demand made, they thought it might be more likely that he was kidnapped for robbery. Like they took him to then rob him of whatever he had on his person. And if that was the case, because there had been no ransom demand, no contact from anybody who had taken him, and they hadn't discovered any body at this point, they thought, well, maybe his body was disposed of in, some remote area, since it hasn't been found in the city of Matamoros. So the U.S. Border Patrol deployed helicopters and, all-terrain vehicles to search all along the Rio Grande, but there was nothing. No trace of him was found. At a certain point, they were so panicked and so frustrated that they called upon the services of a psychic. And this psychic described a vision that she was having of Mark's remains near what she said was like a witch's cauldron. And the mention of that caused authorities, the Mexican authorities, to start worrying that perhaps something evil or eerie was actually going on here. And at the time, no one had any idea just how close to the truth this psychic, her vision, was. So, on April 1st, remember they're on spring break at the beginning of March, so it's been about a month now, and nothing. No sign of Mark, no clues, no nothing. So on April 1st, a car ran through, there was a routine roadblock. And the car sped through, he crossed the international border from Texas and sped through the Mexican federal highway, which connects Matamoros and Reynosa, two cities within the Tamaulipas state. So he just ran through this roadblock. I don't know if it was, to check for drunk driving, to check for drugs, to check for whatever it might be, but it was right there on the border. So instead of stopping this car that ran through the roadblock sounds wrong, more of like I guess it is a roadblock where you're doing a routine check on every car who comes through. So instead of stopping him, the police, for whatever reason, decided to have one of their unmarked vehicles follow this truck. I said for whatever reason. I'd have to imagine that the police in Matamoros and the surrounding areas where there is so much drug crime and violence, that they're kind of, and they know that there's a lot of cartel violence, that they're kind of on the lookout for anything that might lead them to some of that. That's just my guess. So they had an unmarked vehicle follow this truck that ran through the roadblock, and they followed the truck to a place, the Santa Elena Ranch. It was just right outside of Matamoros. This unmarked police car and the policeman in it didn't follow the car onto the ranch. That would have been very obvious. So it stayed back a bit, watching the ranch, watching this truck for about 30 minutes. While they were watching, they didn't see any other cars or any other people, movement, nothing on the ranch. So when the truck left and started heading back to the city, they decided to quickly drive onto the ranch and just look around as quickly as possible. And when they did that, they found several items that felt like it could be related to a cult. And they found what they said was traces of marijuana. I don't know what that means. Because they were just trying to look really quickly before either this truck came back or before anyone who maybe was at the ranch noticed them. So after digging a bit into the Santa Elena Ranch and the truck, the plates, all the information that they had just from seeing the truck, they were able to determine that the driver of that truck was Serafin Hernandez Garcia, the nephew of Elio, the local kind of drug lord whose operations were based in and around that ranch, which is apparently something that they had suspected but never knew and never had any reason to kind of investigate further until the truck goes through the roadblock, drives straight to the ranch. Now they kind of have a probable cause to look into it. But they decided, we're not going to arrest Serafin right away. We're going to try to gather more evidence because they were suspicious that there was, more than just a little bit of pot. They were suspicious that there was more actual very criminal activities. Pot was criminal back then, but more so than that, happening at the ranch. And they believed that it was, that's where the Hernandez family, which was a known organized crime family and gang, that's kind of was their main operation place. So they had several informants throughout Matamoros that they asked to gather information for them about what kind of activities would happen at Santa Elena Ranch. So after they felt that they had sufficient evidence to go back to the ranch and make some arrests, they did just that. On April 9th, they returned to the ranch with additional policemen, and they arrested Serafin Hernandez Garcia. They arrested his uncle Elio, and they arrested several other members of the gang, David Serna Valdez, Sergio Martinez Salinas, and Domingo Reyes Bustamante, Domingo was the ranch's caretaker. They took all of these guys into custody on the basis of the tips that they had gotten from their informants, what they had seen, the traces of marijuana at the ranch when they had seen that, and then, of course, that Serafin ran that roadblock. Quite honestly, I don't know if they even really needed that many reasons. From everything I read, especially back in the 80s, even today it's very corrupt, but back then especially it was. So I'm assuming they could have just arrested them without all of these reasons, but they did. They had reasons. And it was weird because the police didn't quite understand the suspects. They were all very calm, very relaxed. They didn't fight. They kind of like went willingly to jail. Several of the police stayed at the ranch and were questioning another one of the caretakers, who was apparently, somehow they knew that this guy, he really only took care of non-drug related or cartel or gang related things at the ranch. So they spoke to him, and he said, yeah, the members of the Hernandez cartel drug group are often here at the ranch. Police showed this caretaker a picture of Mark Kilroy, and he said, oh yeah, I saw him. And he pointed to this shack that was kind of towards the back of the property. There was some American police officers already back there, headed back there. And before we get to that, we're going to get to the shack and what they find there. Before we do, let's not forget that at the same time that this is happening, this kind of investigation on the ranch, there are other police officers with the gang members in jail that they just arrested in jail. And so they're talking to them about their drug activity and things like that. They're also asking them about Mark Kilroy. And really very quickly, Seraphin confessed that not only Mark, but several other people, including Mark, had been killed over the past few months at the Santa Elena Ranch. And he said, and I'll take you to where, he said, I don't know where all of them are buried, but I'll take you to where Mark is buried. Okay, guys, so I just recorded the whole episode, and it's an hour and 45 minutes. So I am going to end this part 1 right here. And I really, really, really hope that you will tune in next week for part 2. I promise it will be out on Tuesday because it's already recorded. So I'm going to schedule it right now. But the kind of the meat of this story, so to speak, is in the second half. And so I hate to do that to you, but putting out an hour and 45 minute episode, I have to put like 1,000 ad breaks in there, and I just don't want to do that. So we're going to break it into 2. I hope you will tune in and listen. And I say this at the end of next week, but I want to say it now as well. This story was suggested by Dave on Patreon, and I want to say thank you to Dave so much. I really appreciate all of these suggestions that we get, and I have every single one written down. And hope to eventually get to all of them. It just kind of is whichever one like sparks my interest or I can find enough information on. And this one just really sparked my interest, and I feel like it's going to spark some additional similar type stories with cartel in Mexico and stuff. So Dave, thank you. I thank you guys for listening and for, as always, being on this crazy podcasting journey with me and being patient when the episodes come out a day or 2 late. That's never the goal. The goal is always a Monday bonus and a Tuesday episode. And I'm going to try to get back on track and starting next week because the part 2 will be out on Tuesday. I think Monday we're going to do a little Thanksgiving special with me and Mark. So I'm sure some of you will absolutely fucking hate that, and maybe some of you will like it. But anyways, as always, I really, really appreciate you guys. You can listen to a million things, and you're spending your time listening to my crazy storytelling ass, and I really appreciate it. And I love you guys so much. If you are traveling for Thanksgiving, I'll be back before Thanksgiving, but safe travels. And, yeah, happy Thursday. And did I say I love you guys? Okay. Bye.
Death by Southwest is hosted by Jenna Schneider and Margot Carmichael.
Executive produced by Margot Carmichael.
Produced by Jenna Schneider.
Audio editing and sound design by Margot Carmichael.
Music by Soundstripe.
And a special thanks to Edward R. Murrow for letting us borrow his famous sign-off phrase, good night and good luck.